Hello, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to Community Conversations for our next session on wonders of the world. We're changing from geographical wonders and brain wonders into the wonders of the natural world today with some life science faculty here from LCC. So allow me to introduce them, and then I will turn over to them to share all their knowledge. Need my glasses for this part. Okay, today we have Adrienne Godschalx, who teaches microbiology at Lower Columbia College and is perpetually curious about what it means to be alive, which led her to her current role investigating the tiniest living beings. Adrienne enjoys gardening, watercolor, and goes to hip hop class every Friday. Louis LaPierre teaches biological and environmental sciences at Lower Columbia College. He earned his PhD from the University of California, Go Bears. Louis was instrumental in founding the Richard Kelly Learning and Healing Garden here on our campus. And Natalie Tan teaches biology and environmental science at Lower Columbia College and is fascinated by ecosystem connections and symbiosis. She studied forest ecology at the University of Michigan. Go Blue. Okay, good, I got it right. And she enjoys oil painting, wildflower hikes, and raising goats. Please welcome our speakers.
All right. Thank you, Courtney. And just to be clear, the Bears are Cal Berkeley, right? And the Bruins, which are Bears, but the Bruins are UCLA. Not that it matters. You can see I'm wearing all the swag from yeah. All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming. And for those of you viewing through zooming in. Our conversation presentation today is probably the most important sort of global or what's the world, what's the title again? It's wonders. It's the most wondrous wonder of the world, which is our functioning planet, our life-sustaining planet. And we're going to talk about ecosystem services, especially how they support human health and well-being, cultural, spiritual, biological, and of course, all other species on this planet. So I'll go ahead and move along. By the way, this picture, because I was asked about it, there's a bee right here. And this is one of our native bees. And it is a male bee, actually. It's not a female. And I have to say this because it's a pet peeve of mine. I'll be brief with this, but bees are female. Males are brief. They show up at the beginning of the season. They mate with the queen, and then they go off and die. They don't do any work. They contribute genes, some genetics, which are very important. Don't get me wrong, I'm a male. So, but as far as the work of the hive and the provisioning of the young and the laying of eggs, of course, they do none of that. They just simply mate with the queen and then they die. And then they show up later in the season to mate with queens that are going to overwinter. And so there's a brief period where we see them. This one is a longhorned bee, and you see them on sunflowers later in the summer. So if you had sunflowers in your garden and you notice a bee with long antennae, that is a male longhorn bee. And they're good sized. They still do pollinate because they're going after nectar, but they're not collecting pollen to take it back to the young to feed the young. They are simply getting calories from nectar, and they get pollen on themselves, but they don't have specialized structures on their legs to actually carry the pollen. This particular bee is part of the group that includes honeybees. So it has a similar structure, the female does, on her back leg where she packs the pollen. Anyway, unfortunately, this is a Canada thistle, which is an invasive plant species. So pollination is great, but not always when they're pollinating our invasive species. But that's a give and take of life, right, in nature. Anyway, let me see if this works. It does. So I want to begin every presentation, right, begins with a hook. And this hook is a hooked beak of a vulture. And that's just a beautiful shot. I mean, you got to love vultures. I mean, they're kind of one of these things that they're too ugly not to love, right? And although I don't think they're ugly, but a lot of people do. And certainly their regular behavior. These are turkey vultures here. And you've probably seen this on the side of the road, turkey vultures in this case, tearing into a roadkill, in this case, a raccoon. This is an Indian vulture. So vultures are actually, we have three species in North America. We have the turkey vulture, which is the one we see a lot around here. We have the black vulture that comes up into the southeast US a little bit. And then we have, of course, the California condor, which is a Pleistocene era. In other words, it was around when the woolly mammoths and the mastodons and the saber-toothed cats were roaming around, and they would feed on dead mammoths. I mean, this was a big bird for a big reason, which we're going to get to in a moment here. But the reason I'm bringing up this vulture is because the Indian vulture in particular suffered a massive die-off. And the way it was discovered is, I'll talk about in a moment here, but this article right here just came out a couple months ago. And it was determined that this massive die-off and the die-off, actually, I'm going to jump ahead just a second here, 50 million birds down to a few thousand. So a huge crash over 10 years. I mean, that is an incredible population crash. And what happened was, without those vultures, dead things, carcasses, were left basically to rot. They weren't ripped apart because vultures are incredibly efficient. They are supremely adapted to eating dead, rotten flesh. And they have the microbial community. They've got the internal toughness to eat toxic, rotting meat and not get sick and actually really benefit from that. They've evolved to do that. And they're fast, right? They can pick up molecules of rotting carcass, like the sulfur molecules and other molecules that are emanating from a rotting carcass, from hundreds of miles away even, and they find it. You know, just like a fly, right? Will come in and find your compost on the kitchen counter, right? So anyway, so what this article determined is that the loss of these birds basically led to the killing of 500,000, so 500,000 people from 2000 to 2005, because of the increased spread of disease-carrying pathogens. Now, how is that, right? How can just a dead, raccoon-like animal, let's say, or a bunch of them, actually increase disease-carrying pathogens? Well, first of all, how did it happen, right? How did the vultures die off so rapidly? And it had to do with the application of an anti-inflammatory, pain-relieving drug that farmers were applying to their cattle. Okay, so the cattle weren't suffering from pain and that sort of thing, right? Like why we take ibuprofen and that sort of thing. And this was called diclofenac, and that was started in 1994. And what happened was, when cows did die, because they do, right? Vultures would find it immediately, and they'd start tearing into it like they normally do. But it would destroy their livers. So the livers of these adult birds, or juvenile, whatever, ones that were feasting on these carcasses, would die pretty rapidly from liver failure. And that's where the population crashed. And so you've got, these adults are going out to feed, and they're going to bring the food back to the young, but then the adults suffer and die, and then they've got eggs or they've got young, and those die too. And so the population just crashed. So what was the ecological impact again? I kind of mentioned this. The vultures are extreme scavengers. And if it's not consumed, it's consumed by other scavengers, because something's going to eat it, right? And so what you have in a lot of these countries, you have here certainly too, is you have feral animals, or you've got sort of what we call sort of other scavenging type predators that aren't as efficient. They're not as fast at getting to that carcass as vultures are. They might not be as numerous as vultures were when there were 50 million of them. Some things, you've got feral dogs that are carrying rabies, that are vectors for rabies, right, which is a deadly disease. And they increase in population because there's all of a sudden all this carrion around that's not being consumed by the vultures, which are not carriers of any disease. Okay, the birds do not carry and transmit diseases themselves. And then also farmers and other people that find dead carcasses that aren't being eaten by the vultures dump them in rivers, or they dump them in other water bodies, or they throw them off the side of the road. And that also can increase the spread of pathogens and pollute the water and other things. Okay, so that's what actually the research of that article determined what caused the increase in mortality due to these pathogens that are related to contaminated water and that sort of thing. The cultural impact. of this, Zoroastrians. So if any of you are familiar with Zoroastrianism, that is like that is the religion that is the first monotheistic religion that actually gave birth to Christianity. The stories of Zoroaster are actually were borrowed by Christians to tell stories about to tell their stories basically. So the way, the truth, the light was well, that's actually from an Egyptian one, but this is the ancient Persian religion. And so the people in India that practice this religion have this really interesting part of their practice with their dead, and they're called sky burials. And they literally have a platform where they place the deceased on that's open to the sky, and they have their rituals and they you know their departing ritual, and then they walk away, and the vultures descend and consume the carcass within hours. And in their mind, in their religion, their beliefs are that individual is now reborn, is recycled and reborn due to that process. Again, ecologically and human health-wise, it's a brilliant thing because other practices send the deceased on little rafts and set fire to them. And, you know, bodies are full of fat and fluid, and they don't actually burn that well. And so what you have is this partially burned carcass that gets in the river and pollutes the river. So actually, this practice is very ecologically friendly and also helps to reduce disease transmission among humans. So that's an example of a species that was lost from the ecosystem, ecologically extinct. Okay, so they still exist and they're actually rebounding. They're coming back, but it's a slow process because it's not like they're not rabbits, so they're not breeding like crazy. And there's still that chemical out there. So many farmers, you know, the chemical was banned in India. There are alternatives now that are not toxic to vultures. But of course, as you can imagine, there are still farmers using it. And so there's still some of it in the system. But generally speaking, it's the vultures are coming back. And there are other species of vultures too, by the way, that were also hammered. But the Indian vulture was the most common and the one that had the most impact. So we're talking about losing like a keystone species, one that is really important to the ecosystem, has a big impact. And we saw the effects of that, not only ecologically, but also culturally. And that's what ecosystem services are about. They are, they are the benefits that people obtain from ecosystems, okay? And if we obtain benefits from ecosystems, then other species do too. So it's kind of, I know the focus is on humans because for obvious reasons, that's what we are. But the idea is that it's all the other species, and not just the species, but the systems that the living components, right? The organisms, the biodiversity is part of with the non-living components, what we call the abiotic, the non-living, that function and work in a sustainable manner that sustains life and sustains and promotes our life. And there was the Millennium Ecosystems Assessment was a consortium of scientists that sort of came up with this format here, this structure of defining these services. And the most important ones, in a way, the foundational ones, are what we call the supporting services. And those are things like photosynthesis, which is probably the most important chemical reaction that happens in nature, right? It is plants converting the energy of the sun into food, right? So they are fixing the energy from the sun and inorganic carbon dioxide. A lot of that comes out of through volcanism, right? Comes out of the earth. Of course, a lot of it's exhaled by organisms like ourselves. But the important thing is they're able to take raw materials that are inorganic, use energy from the sun, and make food that we and other organisms benefit from. And so that is a foundational type deal. And then you have fertile soils that are maintained, just biodiversity in general. The more species, the more services that we're going to talk about that can be provided, and what we call the redundancy. So if a species does go out, if you have a lot of species, another one can sort of fill in that gap, right? So that's having lots of options like that. And then habitats. Provisioning services provided by ecosystems include food. So some of these are a little overlapping, but fresh water. So a lot of the species out there and just the processes of water moving through a stream, oxygenating, and then of course the microbes and other organisms in there cleaning the water. Of course, food, specific types of food like fish, and then of course wood, which we all benefit from, especially here in Longview, built on that. Regulating services like pollination, pollinators, the shading, right? So sort of creating cool areas, like in Phoenix when it was for over, what, a month or more, it was over 120 or something. 2 summers ago, it wasn't that way this summer as much, but shade was sought after, right? Just shade has a huge impact. Flood control is a huge one. And we've actually seen tremendous flooding in North Carolina and the Southeast in general with these two back-to-back hurricanes all over the world. Lots of flooding going on, likely due to climate change. And more and more evidence is that it is, in fact, climate change because it's happening more often than average over currently. And so, a lot of the flooding is an artifact of modifying the landscape, humans modifying the landscape, paving over areas, diverting streams, channelizing streams, and then flooding happens more readily than if some natural buffers were left intact. And so water purification, which is like a freshwater deal, carbon storage, of course, related to climate change, and clean air, right? Plants clean the air. And so other organisms do as well, but plants are the big ones. And then there's the cultural, which we talked about a little bit with the Zoroastrians, for example. But you've got the beauty, you've got the tourism, recreation, human health, right, is a huge one, especially, again, as we're finding ourselves coming into contact with more what we animal-borne diseases, what we call zoonotic diseases, right? Like bird flu, for instance, which and other viruses and bacteria that are transmitted originally from organisms. A lot of that has to do with, as far as we can tell, some of these ecosystems that are starting to really unravel or become weakened and open up opportunities for human health impacts. And so I'm not going to spend much time on this, but basically these are those ecosystem services we just talked about. And this is just linkages. So the thickness of the arrow is how important, say, like provisioning services are to human health. And then the color is the effect of socioeconomic factors. So mobility, right? Socioeconomic type mobility, being very poor and having a lack of access to resources versus having more access to resources and or having more financial resources, and how that can mediate these effects is the color. So if you're well off, then you can find ways to get food and fresh water and shelter. That's where you can just buy it. So that makes it easier versus if you're not. And so anyway, we could spend hours on just this figure, I guess. But what I like about this is it does list on the right-hand side some of these different issues of human well-being specifically, human health and well-being specifically related to ecosystem services. So ones you might think wouldn't have that sort of a connection. Whoops. There we go. All right, back to the bees. So our bees, here we go. So ecosystem services, the buzz on ecosystem services has directly to do with the buzz, of course, has to do with bees. And in the United States alone, more than 100 crops either they require pollination services by mostly bees. Flies do pollinate a little bit, but mostly it's bees. And some birds and bats pollinate too, but the vast majority, especially here in North America, bees. But still, you're right, beetles. I should say beetles. Yeah, flower beetles. But we'll actually talk about this in a second. So, and the economic value of these native pollinators is estimated to be $3 billion per year in the U.S. And beyond agriculture, pollinators are keystone species. So I brought that term up before, keystone species. If you lose a keystone species, they don't have to be, so they're like a keystone in an arch, right? If you lose that, the arch collapses. And keystone species don't have to be at the top of the food chain or the food pyramid or the food web. They just have to be integral to the structure of the ecosystem. And so in the case, so pollinators, many pollinators are in fact keystone species in keeping, because they're so important to the thriving of the plants, which are really the base of habitats, right? Habitats are defined by the plant communities because the plants really dictate the organisms that can live there. And so this is a really great little poster you can get online from Oregon Bee Project. Bees of Oregon. We don't have a Bees of Washington one like this, but we're so close to Oregon. But what's really nice is this shows, of course, the European honeybee up here in the left-hand corner, which we're all familiar with. It's a non-native, it's an agricultural domesticated animal, and it's inbred generally. But it's important, right? Absolutely important. It is what supports the almond industry in California. Without the honeybee and all the beekeepers trucking their bees to the almond groves when they're in flower, we wouldn't have the almonds, we wouldn't have the cheap almonds like we do. But if you guys remember colony collapse disorder, they really got hammered because there was a sort of an intersection of a lot of different threats, pesticides, invasive mites, viruses. Again, they're inbred, so lack of genetic diversity, where they crashed. Colonies were crashing. They're dead. They would leave their hive and they would never come back. And so there was a real mystery as to what was happening at the time. They've somewhat rebounded, but there's always a real die-off. Like every year we lose way more hives. I mean, we lose over 50%. I should say beekeepers lose over 50%. So it could happen again. And so it's really unpredictable when you're relying on a single species to do everything. And so the Xerces Society, which is an organization that started in Portland, Oregon, but is now international. It's mostly national, but it's international, works with farmers and others, schools, and we'll get to that in a moment, to promote native bees. And most native bees, except for bumblebees, are single nesters. They're solitary. One queen, again, the male comes out in the early spring, mates with the female, he goes off and dies. And then that one queen does all the work. She goes out, she collects pollen, a lot of them dig holes in the soil, they lay their eggs in little cells, they give them a little, we call it a little cake of pollen to feed on. And she does all the work, a single little bee, and these are tiny. Some of them, you guys are familiar with mason bees, those are actually big. Most of the native bees are, quarter of an inch or so, and they can dig a hole in the ground that could be a few feet deep with just their little mandibles and their little tarsi, their little legs or feet. And so they're incredible hard workers. They only live for a month or so. So they're feverishly going around getting pollen, laying eggs, doing all that. And so Xerces says, hey, plant hedgerows, promote diversity. Those bees, of which there are 300 or more just in our region alone, can shore up the slack on the honeybees. They can help pollinate. They're active earlier in the day than honeybees are because they're used to the climate more. And they're actually earlier in the season, earlier in the day, and later in the evening too, because because they don't have a long life like honeybees do. They're not going to live very long. So they work like crazy. All right. By the way, these are not bees. These are wasps, yellow jackets, and most of them are predators. In fact, all of them are. All of them are predators. That's where they get most of their calories and protein. However, I took pictures of ones on flowers because they also go after nectar, because nectar is a carbohydrate, right? It's sugar, and it's sucrose sugar. And so they love that because it's an easy, quick energy source. And they get pollen on themselves by crawling over flowers. So they kind of pollinate, but they're not doing it on purpose. Bees are doing it on purpose. Bees are going after that pollen because they're going to feed it to their young, and they carry a lot more, and they're more efficient at transferring that pollen among flowers for the pollination purposes than these incidental pollinators, which include beetles, by the way. And I love beetles. I study beetles. All right. So here's produce with bees. This is what we usually see right now, right? Abundant produce. Go to Chuck's Produce, by some of the best produce. And this is what it would be without bees, because so much of our agriculture, requires pollination. Yeah, so oranges get self-pollinate. A lot of these, a lot of plants actually can self, and some of these are hybrids. So even if you did cross-pollinate them, you wouldn't get you certainly wouldn't be able to produce others. But apples, for instance, are big ones that require pollination. And part of it too is you would just have a lot less, right? So you might have some boutique fruits and vegetables that people are hand pollinating, that sort of thing. But generally speaking, you would lose a lot. that's all I have to say right now. So I'm passing the mic, not physically, to Natalie.
That's me too. All right, can you guys hear me? Okay. So we are going to talk about one of our crucial ecosystem services, which is fertile soil. And this starts in the Pacific Northwest in a rather unlikely place, in an organism that never touches the soil at all, and that is Pacific salmon. So we know that our salmon populations start out their life early on in Pacific Northwest streams and rivers, and then they very quickly make their way out into the ocean. When they do that, they spend 3-4 years out there gaining nutrients out in the ocean, and it's only at their end of their life that they come back to the Pacific Northwest, into our rivers, into our streams, spawn, and then they die. And that is the end of the story for salmon, but it is the beginning of the story for fertile soil. So all of that time that salmon were living in the ocean, they were gaining fantastic ocean-based sources of nitrogen and phosphorus. And on land, nitrogen is something that is limiting to plants. So we know that farmers will add NPK fertilizer to our plant-based systems, and that's going to help our plants grow. But in the ocean, nitrogen is less limiting than on land. And so salmon are a crucial source of nitrogen for the Pacific Northwest because they bring extra nitrogen up our rivers and then deposit their bodies onto the stream bank. The nitrogen, though, does not stop just there on the edge of streams. It continues to persist in the environment because who eats the salmon are things like bears and other smaller predators. So bears will grab salmon out of streams, alive or dead, doesn't matter, they don't care, and they will pull it into the forest to eat. Now, bears are picky and they like high-fat diets, so they only eat 2 parts of the salmon, their brains and their eggs, and that is it. And they leave the rest on the forest floor to rot. And that carcass then goes on to fertilize the soil underneath it. Now, the bear will go on to roam far and wide. We know bears have incredibly large habitats, and they're going to leave poop behind, and that poop is laced with nitrogen and phosphorus from the ocean. So our Pacific Northwest forests have a ton of fertilization created just from these salmon bodies. And it's not just bears. I mean, our smaller predators, they eat some salmon that the bear left behind, right? And then they're going to poop throughout the forest. And it goes down to even our teeny tiny predators, like slugs. They'll crawl up onto a salmon carcass. They'll eat a few nibbles, and then they'll just slink on out of there. And what they leave behind is a trail of slime that is laced with nitrogen from the ocean. So that is fertilizing the forest floor. Now, we have known since 2001 that, well, we have known for a very long time that this is crucial for our ecosystems, but we have been able to do some really fantastic studies of what the effects actually are from salmon fertilization versus areas that might not receive salmon fertilization because there are dams blocking the roots of salmon into those areas. So some of the first researchers that did these studies were Hellfield and Nyman, and they found that 20%-ish of the nitrogen found in shrubs and trees next to Pacific Northwest streams that had active salmon runs was nitrogen from the ocean. And subsequent studies have shown that sometimes plants and trees will have up to 70% of their total nitrogen that is ocean-based isotopes, ocean-based nitrogen. Other studies, I think there's a 16-year study that these folks did more recently, and they actually took a stream that had an active salmon run, took all the dead carcasses off one side of the stream and threw it on the other one for 16 total years. That's pretty messy work. And what they found was that the growth rates between the 2 sides of the stream differed 3-fold. So the trees on one side of the stream grew 3 times faster than the trees on the other. So that is the equivalent, they said, of a Sitka spruce reaching a certain diameter in 86 years instead of in 300 years. So it's a pretty impressive effect on our forests. So that's salmon providing an ecosystem service for the forest. And the forests, we know, provide many provisioning services for us in the Pacific Northwest. We get a lot of economic benefit from our forests. But the forests also provide ecosystem services for the salmon. So when we have breeding streams that the salmon utilize, and those streams have vegetation on the sides, that vegetation is going to shade the stream. That's going to cause that stream to be cooler, which is going to cause our salmon, our juvenile salmon, to have better success at living. Also, when we have fallen logs in our streams, that's going to cause our stream to take a more circuitous path. A stream that winds is going to be a cleaner stream. It's going to have a slower flow. That's going to cause particles to drop out of it. Salmon like clean, clear water, and they like water with a lot of gravel. And so another thing then that vegetation on the side of streams is going to do is it's going to keep the soil in place and keep it out of our streams and rivers. So it prevents landslides. So this is a nice, healthy river system with trees on either side of it. It has shade, right? It has landslide control, and it didn't have fallen logs, but we actually provided an ecosystem service for this river. The tribes up in Squim made what's called engineered log jams. And this is a new thing that a lot of our rivers that have dam removal projects are starting to create, is trying to get that stream not to be straight, but to get it to wind a little bit. And putting these engineered log jams in place can start to create that good habitat for salmon so we can bring them back in healthy numbers. Now, landslide control, right, that our trees give the salmon is also going to help us. And we know that when we do not have vegetation in place, the land is more likely to move. That's going to hurt the water quality of the river. This is Highway 6 to PL in Lewis County. And this is a clear cut right here. And then the Chehalis River is seen there. So this is going to impact the water quality in the Chehalis River. It's going to make the fish sad. It's going to stick in their gills. It's not going to be a great place for them to lay their eggs. But it also has huge ramifications for us, right? Landslides cause property loss, and that's what happened here. And this landslide also blocked a major highway. That's an enormous amount of money that we then have to deal with. So one thing that we can do if we want to keep the trees providing this ecosystem service for us is to encourage more strips of trees left behind or thinning. That landslide may not have happened had a few trees been left in place for their roots to keep that soil in place, right? So pretty crucial on the edges of the highway. And you can see that there was an intentional strip of trees left behind right between the clear cut and the highway. It just wasn't enough. Okay, so back to our water quality. When we have vegetation around a stream, it's going to provide good quality water for salmon, but it's also going to provide good quality water for us. A lot of cities across the United States use what's called surface water. This is water that's brought from reservoirs, from lakes, from rivers. It's more expensive to drill wells, right? And provide water for cities in that way. So when we can use surface water, that's going to save taxpayers money. But in order to do that, we need to have healthy ecosystems in our watershed. Now, the alternative to the landscape providing an ecosystem service to us is that we have to provide that ecosystem service for us. So we could clean water. Say we had some yucky water that had a bunch of sediment in it. An easy solution to that is to put sand, gravel, and charcoal together, and many municipalities have to do this to filter out that particulate matter. And that is fine, but it is expensive. And I'm going to show you an example of the immense contrast in expense for a system where we have kept our drinking water supplies and our watershed clean versus not. So watershed is a word that I need you to know so I can give you this example. And here's a picture of a watershed near us, right? The Columbia River watershed. We are all in this watershed. It spans 4 different states and 2 different countries. And so everything in green here is considered in the Columbia River watershed, which means that any snowmelt or any rainfall that falls on the map in a green location is going to make its way into a creek, into a river, into another river, and then eventually into the Columbia River, which is going to pass by us and then go out into the ocean. So that's all one watershed, but watersheds can be many different sizes. Here's the Cowlitz River watershed, right? A bit smaller. It's denotated by the highest ridge line that is going to cause that water to go into the Cowlitz River. Okay, I'm going to take us across the country, though, and show you a different watershed. So this watershed here is the Catskill Mountains, and this is a watershed that feeds New York City. So the area there in green is all part of a watershed that feeds into an aqueduct right here that pulls from a reservoir. And this aqueduct, there are two of them, then go into New York City. There's another aqueduct right here, and I don't think these are the only ones. I think there are quite a few different ways that New York City gets its water. But this specific Catskill Mountain watershed has a cool story. So before the 90s, New York City water was ranked one of the best waters in the nation. They were pulling surface water from these reservoirs. They did not need to filter it. They just needed to treat it, which meant they chlorinated it and then they sent it out. It was clean and it tasted good and it did not have contaminants. But because agriculture and poor sewage systems existed in this area, and they started fertilizing more in those agricultural regions, their water started being more and more contaminated, and they weren't able to use it without filtration. So they looked into what their alternatives were. And so this was what they were thinking of doing, is basically using a sand-based industrial filtration system. And the cost for New York City to do a sand-based filtration system was $6 to $8 billion. So that's a huge price to pay for something that they used to get for free. So they decided to do something different, and that was to work with the ecosystem services that the land could provide for them for free. So they spent a fraction of that money, $600 million instead of $6 billion, and they invested it in land. So the first thing that they did is that was incredibly political, it was contentious, it was uncomfortable. And that was, they asked people in the Catskill Mountain area to not develop their land any further than they had. So that meant private landowners that had one house on their property could not subdivide and make that into two houses. And what they did, along with those restrictions, was pay the landowners to keep their land preserved. So essentially, they said, instead of doing any further development, we would like to just pay you this money, and you can hold on to your house for as long as you want, but you're not allowed to have any more structures on the property. The other thing that they did is when landowners wanted to sell, they were the ones that bought the land and then protected it. And then another thing they did was they gave money to landowners to subsidize better quality sewage, septic systems, on their property. This ended up to be, though when it went in, it was very politically contentious, it ended up to be incredibly successful. New York City now has the champagne of drinking waters. This restoration project worked, and people are now relatively happy with it. But part of that is because people now, don't have that pain when they're going into that region to buy property. They know that they're not allowed to develop it. And so that's a big thing to remember. We have an example of this actually in Washington State. So King County had similar concerns, and they used New York City's idea of working with ecosystem services to protect their Cedar River watershed. Right here is where a lot of the water that goes into Seattle gets pulled from. Notice they're pulling from way further out of city limits, in the mountains where the water is probably more clean than in the industrial areas that might be more contaminated closer to the city. But what they've done is they put a moratorium on development in that area. But the way that they put the moratorium on, I think, is really interesting. It works with capitalism. And there aren't a lot of examples where environmental policy and capitalism work well together, but this is one of them. So they decided what we want is people in the Cedar River watershed to not be further developing their land. But we don't want to make people super, super mad. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to pretend like everybody has a certain right to development, and people can sell the right to development to others. People in the rural areas in the watershed in question could sell their development rights to people here, who live in the more industrial and urban areas. That's going to concentrate the growth of Seattle upwards instead of outwards, which is going to help a lot of things like traffic not being any worse than it already is. And it's going to compensate rural landowners for keeping their land more pristine and providing a ecosystem service for the people of Seattle. So this has worked relatively well. Again, politically controversial, but ecologically a really sound policy, and it works with capitalism. We can also, though, clean water in other ways. So we don't have to use a forest-based system to clean water. Marshes and ponds and wetlands do a fantastic job of slowing down water so particles drop out. Native plants can be added to marshes and wetlands so those plants both intercept but also can eat up some of the extra nutrients. And then microbes will just naturally come into systems like that and start munching away at all sorts of excess organic matter, nutrients, and stuff like that. And what comes out of wetlands is generally a lot cleaner than what comes in. So we can treat water, all types of water, including sewage, in this manner. So this is a picture of Arcata, California's wastewater treatment plant, probably different than a usual sewage treatment plant that you envision that has some, concrete ponds and a lot of aeration tanks and a lot of added microbial activity. But these are a series of natural ponds in a city park that people access. People walk these trails. They bird watch on this area. They run throughout here. They're not particularly stinky. And the water that comes in is sewage. And by the time it makes its way through a series of different ponds, what exits this is actually just as clean as what comes out of Longview sewage treatment plant. It's perfectly safe to go into Humboldt Bay and be around the ocean critters. So with that, I think we will turn it over to our microbiologist, Adrienne.
And I'm going to talk more about poop. Microbes love poop. Speaking of poop, thank you, Natalie. Also, plug, we watched a brilliant conversation about beavers. Beavers do some amazing ecosystem services. I mean, every organism has its own service, but that's a good one. There's a Beavers Northwest. That's an organization worth looking into if you at all are interested. So speaking of poop, one of the other challenges, if we don't slow down the water and let it percolate through soil where it can be filtered out and or allow it to go through a series of marshes, we run into other issues like eutrophication. So in addition to the manures that are associated with farmland, there's also the issue of fertilizer running off, whether it is in that manure format or inorganic fertilizers. Both can lead to eutrophication. So this word eutrophication is describes when there's an excess of nutrients in a water system. And normally that's not the case. But when there's any kind of excess, it creates this bloom of this beautiful protist here. Another microbe that can use that excess nitrogen and take off. So in this case, this is beautiful, but the problem is that those cells will grow and photosynthesize and grow and photosynthesize, but then they crowd out and they die and they sink, and the CO2 that they emit, it can create a dead zone. So suddenly we have a pocket of water that has no oxygen and fish like oxygen. So then it creates a dead zone of fish and all kinds of other things that are not so great. So this is the Gulf of Mexico, and those farmers at the base of the Mississippi River down in Louisiana, they don't love this either because they want a healthy aquaculture. They want the shrimp and the fish and all of that as well. So it's harming everyone when we have this system. And Natalie mentioned, so if we don't have our natural ecosystem processes in place, we often will try to fill in for them. But often we do a pretty poor job of filling in for ecosystem services like soil nutrition. So this is a graph of the fertilizer use per hectare of cropland back in 2017. How long ago was that now? 5 years? 6 years? So it's already outdated. Who knows what this looks like now? Could be worse. Hopefully it's getting better because we don't need this much of an addition. Microbes have everything that they could possibly need, and I'm going to tell you why. So here is the middle. Oh no. Okay, no laser. But the blue represents nitrogen, is the N in NPK. The red is the phosphorus, And the lighter blue is the potassium, or K. So where are these in nature? How would microbes get them? Nitrogen is actually in the air. 79, or roughly about 80% of the air around us right now in our atmosphere is made of nitrogen, but it's a triple bonded nitrogen that plants can't access. It's very inert. It can't react with a biological system. So we need microbes to fix that. And the way they do is through the nitrogen cycle. So every step in the nitrogen cycle has to be done by a microbe. These are, if we're including some eukaryotes in that category, none of this happens by anything except a microbe. So the nitrogen that's in the air can either get into the soil by a nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Has anyone heard of rhizobia? Or the little bacteria that bean plants have? Or Natalie has. That's fine. Thanks, biologists. It's great. Well, let me tell you, I'm glad we're here. So bean plants, actually, they have a special relationship with bacteria that can take that nitrogen out of the air, break that triple bond, and give the plant direct access to that nitrogen, all for the small cost of a little bit of photosynthesis sugars, which is great. So they have a great internal symbiosis. But those kinds of nitrogen fixers is what we call those bacteria. They can also just live in the soil. And there are bacteria that can do that for other elements too, like phosphorus and potassium, but we're going to talk about them next. So it gets from the air into the soil by bacteria, and every other step of the process is different bacteria, and it goes back into the air when that oxygen gets ripped off if there's a lack of oxygen. So if your soil's compacted, you're going to lose all those nutrients back to the air because of your microbes. So you want to keep air in your soil with good structure. So nitrogen's in the air, check. We can get that from a microbe. Phosphorus, potassium, they are more so in rocks. But I'll give you good news. We can also get those too. So there was this awesome title. Scientists waited 2.5 years to see whether bacteria can eat rock. And this is a photograph of that study where they call this chemolithotrophy, which is where bacteria are able to actually just take rock and use it as their source of electrons. And then they take all those minerals in the rock, and now that's part of their bodies. So if we have potassium and phosphorus in rocks, along with magnesium and sulfur and boron and all of those micronutrients that we need to be healthy, and we get it from our carrot. The carrot got it from the bacteria in the soil who are eating the rocks. So that's pretty cool. Well, microbes also eat each other. So the cool thing is that it also, the more complex the soil ecosystem down there, the more concentrated that can be. So just like the bears in the forest eating the salmon, here underground, we have amoeba that come and they gobble up all those bacteria and they concentrate the nitrogen and poop it out because they can't handle that much nitrogen. So having a complexity of interactions can increase the nutrients that plants have access to in your soil, which then allows your carrots that you're eating to have even more nutrients in them when you eat them. And then your bones have more potassium, calcium, magnesium, all those things that you need to be a healthy human with a good functioning immune system. So there's an ecosystem service for you. Another shout out to all of these different interactions that are happening. One lesser known secret is that plants will spit out a whole bunch of sugars to attract all of these microbes to their roots. So root exudates are part of that. And if you want to know more about this story, there's another recording from my previous community conversations that has a lot more details. But this is why we do compost, and the microbiology students on campus get in their hands dirty, and we make compost to cultivate these microbes and give back to this. Our ecosystem service for them is to help grow them in big piles. And there's a cool collaboration that I'm going to just glaze over a little bit between Natalie and I. We have our classes work on the same plots and measure different elements of that. It's pretty fun to collaborate. So, and it turns into this. So here, this bed has been grown with compost, and this one did not have any. it already had pretty good soil, but you can almost see that the height on the compost bed is much taller. The shorter bed has fewer corn stalks. They're not as thick, they're not as green, and Natalie had to keep replanting to actually get them to grow. So there's a lot of benefits to getting a really good, healthy, rich compost for your soil. And if you're interested, this is our on-campus garden. We created a form. So to create the conversation part, feel free to use your camera phones and take a little, like hold up the camera part at this QR code, and it'll give you a form if you're interested at all in getting involved in that garden. And I can send you that link as well. So we can come back to that. And I think that's all I have. Oh, we'll talk about that later. Pass it back to you, Natalie. If anyone needs that link, I can give you the link.
Yeah, we just have two more things that we wanted to talk about.
Oh, you have a...
I have a thing regarding sustainability stuff that we are doing on campus. One of the things that we're working on this year is applying for a tree campus certification. That's probably something that we are very much already doing. We have plenty of trees on campus. We're treating them very well. If we need to cut one down, we replace it. So this is through the Arbor Day Foundation, and we're really excited about this as a potential opportunity. Something that I've been working on with my students is mapping out our trees, identifying all of them. We have more than 400 trees on campus, so this is not a small job, but it's just one thing that we are doing in terms of tracking our carbon input and output on campus, because my goal eventually is to be able to take this map and then maybe even calculate how much carbon are the trees on campus pulling from the air and sequestering versus how much carbon are the energy systems in our campus producing. What are our impacts when it comes to climate change as a campus? So it's one of the many sustainability projects that we are doing. And Louis, you had Bee Campus stuff.
Right on. So yeah, so we're almost done here. So LCC, so we're working on tree campus certification, which ties in with Arbor Day, as Natalie had mentioned, and Longview, as you guys know, is a tree city through the Arbor Day Foundation. And actually it's the second tree city in Washington State. The first one was Ellensburg. I don't know when exactly, but we've been a tree city for a long time. The Bee Campus is modeled on the Bee City or Tree City sort of idea. And we are certified as a Bee Campus. And what that means is that similar to being a tree campus, which we're striving to be, is it's about education, educating the community, of course, educating our students, promoting bee welfare, right? The health of bees, the diversity of bees, learning from the bees. Pollinators in general, actually, is what we lump into that. And so with my students, and it's only been 2 years, by the way, in 2022, we were certified. So with my students, I have them put together mason bee houses. So we go out, we cut up the tubes. We use teasel, which is a weed on the side of the highway. It's that thistle relative that has a little spiky flowering stalk, but the stems look like bamboo, but they're easier to work with than bamboo is. And they're around, so why not use them? Here's a male and female mason bee mating. The female's in there, the male's trying to mate. So this is early in the season. So I've got my students working on that in the greenhouse. We dissect the previous season's mason bee tubes to extract cocoons to put them out underneath so that when they emerge, they have housing right there that they can start working with. And then, of course, they go around to all of our flowers. Here are students entering data, dissecting the tubes. And then we also, later in the season, in the spring, we go out and we survey bee diversity. So this starts around mid-May to June, just before spring quarter ends, actually. So students go out with nets, and this is in the garden again, but we stick around the garden. If they see a bee on a flower, they net the bee and then put it in a tube with a cap, and it's an interesting process to watch. I don't have a video for that, but if a student's never netted a bee and put it in the tube, it's a fun process. Anyway, you take a picture, they take a picture, right? Everyone has good cameras on their phones nowadays, of the numbered tube with the bee inside and the flower it was visiting. So we're trying to collect the data. What flowers are these bees visiting? And then take a picture. Oh, we put them on ice. I don't have a picture of that. We chill the bees. So this is catch and release. We're not killing these bees. We do save a couple for our collection to really get a certain identification. Remember, these are bees that only live a month or so. So, but we do take a picture. They're cold. They just come off the ice, so they're asleep and they're warming up, but they stay still long enough for us to take a good photo of them. And then we leave them alone and they warm up in the sun and they fly away. And like I said, we get nice pictures. Some of these are not native flowers. This is honeysuckle. I forget what this one is, Chinese something. But then, of course, we do have native plants in our garden. Here, this is Sedalcia. This is one of the native mallows. And so that's one of the great things that we do. So it's education. We're trying to get an idea of what are the pollinators on campus. And I don't have pictures of other things, but the drone flies, the hover flies that look like bees, right? We also capture anything that's visiting a flower. We net and we record just to get an idea of everything that's visiting these flowers. So that's part of what we're trying to do here on campus is become more sustainable. We're trying to educate students and community members on sustainability, on ecosystem services, our connection, how important other species and thriving ecosystems, functioning ecosystems are, how important they are to human health, mentally, physically, all of that. But last but not least, a few other things. IPM is what we're doing here on campus, integrated pest management. Now that is not no pesticides. It is using only pesticides when necessary and in certain areas. Our garden, no pesticides, pesticide free. The baseball field, they do occasionally use pesticides. And that's the Bee City folks that certified LCC, they allow IPM. They want an IPM program because IPM is reducing pesticide use. If you use pesticides as needed, only when needed, and appropriate amounts, then it can be done in a sustainable like manner, basically, because it's a reality, right? I mean, saying no to pesticides and you wouldn't have anybody certifying as Bee Campus, unfortunately. We use battery and human-powered landscaping tools here. We use those lovely, quiet, emissions-free lawnmowers and leaf blowers. And not only is it good for the students, but it's also good for the workers. They're not breathing in what is absolutely the most polluting tool you could possibly use, which is a single-stroke, gas-powered lawnmower or leaf blower. They're loud, they're spewing out emissions. A lot of people that are using them aren't wearing any sort of personal protective equipment. They're horrible. They really are. Not on just a climate change issue, just on a human health issue. So the battery-powered ones, battery technology now on these things, right? They seem to last forever. They're super powerful. So we use those. It's great. Our newer buildings and remodels they do stress energy efficiency. Part of that's the state we live in, requires that. But they're also, and so there are incentives and requirements for LCC to integrate efficiency standards into new buildings that we're putting in and any remodels that happen. And then something that we're planning right now, which is kind of exciting, food waste reduction and recycling. So our food services area, we're hoping to get these little, basically sort of industrial type composting machines where food waste and bioplastics, right, like all those plastic cups that are made of corn plastic or whatever, can go in and be composted and add to basically the fertilizer, that sort of thing around campus. So again, sort of that footprint, right? We have all this food waste, instead of it just going to the landfill, and paying for that, we're going to just compost it and keep it on campus and fertilize plants with it. And actually, we also work with the food pantry, which provides food for students in need. And we've actually been, they come and they pick from the garden, they pick tomatoes and other greens and things and sort of put care packages together. So that's been a really cool relationship that we've been working on as well. And I'm so excited since Natalie and Adrienne have come on, fairly new faculty here full time, and they're excited to use the garden, and it's been an awesome relationship. That is it, actually, I think, yes. And so thank you, everyone.
Yeah. Thank you to our speakers. And we are out of time. So if you have any questions, you can talk to me. You can talk, well, I don't know anything, but you can talk to them. And thank you, and come again next week.